In this tutorial, I'd like to revisit the task that we did in the very first screencast in georectification of a historical map. I'm going to use the same georeferencer in this exercise, but show you another way to do it, making use of a basemap in QGIS. Along the way, we'll also talk a little bit about some ways of getting some handy basemaps into QGIS. For this exercise, I first want to acknowledge the really excellent job done by Klas Karlsson, someone who has created a whole series of wonderful YouTube videos about QGIS over a period of some years now. And in particular for this exercise, he has put together and hosts a Python script that will allow you to easily import into QGIS a collection of base maps that get stored here in the XYZ tiles. Running his script in the plugins Python console here will add all of these links to XYZ tiles for various popular map services, including Google Maps, OpenStreet Map, and a few others. The way that you do this, and the way that I have done this, is I've opened up the script that he has online. It's on his GitHub page. You can see the body of the script down below here. If I click on raw, you get the actual raw script that you can then directly run in the Python console here. When you do that, you'll get this list of base maps on the left here. They are loaded as rasters rather than vectors. So if you were to load in, for example, OpenStreet Map monochrome, you'll get different results for different zoom levels. And as you keep zooming in, it'll get more and more detailed. Now, at least on my version of QGIS on the Mac, it's always a little pixelated. The resolution is not great. I'm not sure if that's something about the way that this is accessed or a bug in the software, but it does provide you with a handy raster background. But you can't do anything with this. You can't style the individual streets, etc. So we're not going to be actually using it for today's exercise, but you could be using it for today's exercise. The other things that we're going to use for this is some natural earth data for countries to help us kind of zoom in on where we want to go, and a historical map of Yangon or Rangoon in Myanmar or Burma from 1914 that's hosted by the Perry-Castañeda library map collection here. Okay, so we're basically going to go through and do another georectification exercise. First, let me put in the countries here. Oops, I didn't want it to run some Python code. So let's cancel that. If I zoom in on Rangoon here in Burma for a second, and show the OpenStreet Map, you'll see that we have Burma with us. But like I said, we're not going to use that rather pixelated base map. And instead, I'd like to install a plugin called Vector Tiles Reader. To do so, I think this works for both QGIS 2 and QGIS 3. You go into Manage Plugins, type in Vector Tiles, and if it's not installed, then click on Install the plugin. When you do that, you'll have this new option in your vector menu where you can say Add Vector Tiles Layer. I'm going to do this here. Clicking this shows you a collection of you can't see it because it dips below here, but there's an add button below there. That's the only important thing here. What this will do is this will pull in vector tiles from openmaptiles.com. Now, if when you watch this screencast, if that's no longer working for some reason, because it's very generous for them to provide the download of these rather large layers from them, know that this plugin can use any connection to a vector tile service. So there may be other things to connect to in the future. But at least from here you can download directly OpenStreetMap material. So what I'd like to do is to create a vector base map that I can modify and style just the way I want. And I would like to use a number of the possible OpenStreetMap sublayers that you can use here. And I'm going to, on the Mac, hold down the Command key as I click on Buildings. I can't remember if it's Land Use or Land Cover. It's one of those, so I'm going to click both of those. And I'm going to bring in Transportation and Water and Waterway. This will provide the ocean, and I think this will provide the rivers and streams and canals in the city. Now, some of these others are useful too, but we don't need all of them, to be honest. It'll show you here that your current extent is 20 tiles. So even the city itself is only around here. So I'm pulling in a lot of material from outside of Yangon, but hopefully it'll work smoothly. There's an add button down below the screen here. If I click on this, and if I get rid of countries, you'll now see the OpenStreetMap data for this area. If I then zoom in just on the old city of Yangon, notice that as I zoom in, it reloads the material, and it takes a little bit of time to load in all of those streets. And I get a nice base map to work off of for while I georectify a historical map. The advantage of doing it this way is that I can now go into these individual vector layers that are being dynamically generated as I zoom in and out. Right-click on any of them. If I push this up, you should be able to see it. And I can export and save the features as, and I can then permanently save that as a shapefile that I can keep for my own reference. Now, we may not like the thickening of those yellow lines. We may want to style our roads a little bit differently. So I'm going to show you how you could do that while at the same time saving the very nice rule-based styling that already exists. If I go into the properties for this layer, you'll see that the symbology is rule-based, and they have a very complex series of rules for the coloring in of everything from bridges to highways to railway lines, etc. If I save this layer myself, and I save it as transportation, for example, and I turn off the transportation layer here, I'm getting a completely different styling. And what's more, I'm just getting center lines here, and there's no differentiation between rail lines and streets. Now, if I wanted to reproduce the styling, but only partially, that OpenStreetMap uses, I can go into the properties here, and I see this style here, and I can then save the style as a QGIS layer style file. What that'll do is export all of these nice rules into a special style file that QGIS can recognize. And that means in my newly saved and no longer dynamically loaded from the server streets, if I then go into the properties for that layer in symbology and switch to rule-based, I can now go back into the style and load the styling that I just did a second ago. I've actually created one earlier. So now I've loaded in all of those lovely rules, and I can apply that, and it's reapplied the OpenStreet Map styling. But in my case, for example, maybe I just want to have special rules for railways and such. If you double click on any of these, you can see the way that they've constructed their rule, and you can see the way that they've styled any given line, and go in and customize that in whatever way you would like to. Okay, so I have, let's see, I wonder why the styling disappeared as I moved out. It should have loaded. Oh, I pressed cancel, that's why. If I go back into this, click OK, click OK. All right, there we go. Now it should retain that styling even when I zoom out. Okay, so we actually don't even need this dynamically downloaded one, and I can move this up to the top. I've got my roads. I could do the same thing now for the water and the buildings. I can save that. In fact, let's do it for the buildings because that's one that we're going to use quite a bit. If I right click, go down to export, save features as, Rangoon buildings. Actually, I'll do it here because of a bug in the way this is saved. Rangoon buildings, press OK, overwrite the file. Okay, so now I've created my own offline copy of the Rangoon buildings. In fact, we can turn all of this stuff off now if we wanted to, and just keep, well, let's keep the water on as well, because that's handy to have. Now I've got my map of Rangoon, I've got the streets, and I have the buildings as they are known to OpenStreet Map. The advantage of saving these buildings here is that you can see that in the cases where those buildings are all nicely laid out, if I have it selected and I click the select features, all of these features are editable by me. I can run all of the things like dissolve and difference and clip, etc., or append new features to that. This is mine to play with now that I have this offline version. And that'll be handy if we want to create a map based on a historical map where there are significant differences between what is present in the 21st century and what is present in the 19th century. But there is also a lot of overlap. I know for a fact that this area of the city is very similar in early 20th century and 19th century Rangoon. So we might want to use those features to save us a lot of work afterwards. Okay, so this brings us to the beginning, as it were, of where we were in the first exercise. If I zoom out just a little bit here and just focus in on this this area in the south of the city, let's now go in and georectify a historical map. Hopefully you have added the georeferencer. Go back to the first screencast to revisit the issues that we had with that if you haven't done so already. And if you open up the georeferencer like this, let's add our historical map by clicking the Add Raster button. And I've got a couple different maps here, but I'm going to use Rangoon 1914. Okay, it's loaded in my points already here from the last time that I played this, but I'm going to add some more to show you what I've been doing. Remember that our last example had grid lines with latitudes and longitudes that made it really easy to add. And I told you then that you can also add points that you have an exact latitude and longitude for that you found on Google Maps or elsewhere. Another way is to make use of the canvas of your map where you've got another base layer. So for example, what if I wanted to find let's see, comparing these two maps here, is there another point where I think I've got a connection? I notice, for example, that there is the entry to that waterway and an entry to another waterway over there, which I think is this one right here. So I'm going to add a point at that head point for the waterway. And instead of entering in the map coordinates directly, there's a button here that says From Map Canvas. When you click on that, it makes your other map disappear. A bit annoying, to be honest, but that's another way of doing this. So I'm going to click at the entrance point of this waterway here. That'll input the coordinates for this coordinate reference system here. And now this point here is linked to that point there. So I've gone through and done something similar for each of these other points. I've clicked on the corner of a block that still exists now in the 20th century. I've clicked at the edges of these blocks. I've done From Map Canvas, and actually I could do a better job, couldn't I? It's not exactly on the edge. But if I'd done it more carefully and clicked exactly on the corner edge of each of these corners, that would have yielded a more accurate representation of this map. And I've tried to find as many points as I can. In one case, the middle of this little island in this park. The same thing up here, that little island in satellite imagery at least is still listed on the base map that I was working on before. When you have a collection of points and you're happy with the number of those points, you can try thin plate spline, and I've chosen the target SRS to be that of the map that I have here. And then I press the play button, and it says that the raster was successfully generated, and I can see my map is on the other side here. Zooming out shows me that the map is at least roughly in the right place. To see how close the fit is, I'm going to go into Properties and lower the transparency a bit. And it's looking pretty good. It's looking quite good, actually. I could zoom in directly to this area where the maps are very similar to what they are today. I could turn on my Rangoon buildings map here so you can see the contrast even more clearly. So if I want to now create my own version of a fully digitized map of Rangoon as of 1914 or 1917, whenever this map comes from, there may be features from that old map that I wish to digitize and bring back in. For example, I see there's the wharf there. There is a sailor's home. There is a sawmill. There is some oil works, a rice mill, a timber depot, more rice mills, a marketplace. The railway station's considerably smaller. The hospital has moved somewhat compared to where it is today. I remember seeing that this was the hospital now. Back then, it was horticultural gardens. We have a jail garden over here and the central jail. We don't have any building data for that. We have a race course and a parade ground. That's clearly been replaced by other things in the meantime. This little lake here and this park has been replaced by these buildings here. So if I wanted to go and create a digitized version of this historical map, the first thing I might do is go through and delete, go into my Rangoon buildings, select, and I can select a bunch of features, these for example, and I could delete those features. I'm just going to delete them all for a second. Delete all of these features, but maybe keep all of those. This didn't exist, so let's delete those, and so on. I can go in and use the existing 21st century buildings as kind of a base, as a starting point for those cases where those buildings, or at least the footprints of those buildings, still existed back in that earlier time. And then editing off of this, if I have my historical map on, and I move this to the top here, I could then go in and add some polygons for the race course, for example. There are ways of making a circular shape. There, right click. So I've got a new shape for that. I could do the same for the jail. I could do a separate layer perhaps for lakes and water stuff. I could draw in a new version of the railway station and digitize various features from the historical map, deleting all of the stuff that is no longer relevant for this historical moment in time. You can see here there's been some land reclamation in this area here, judging by the course of the river. Once you finish and you're going to export your map, then obviously you'd no longer need the historical map, because at that point you should have brought in whatever blocks or points that you wanted. If you decide, for example, that you don't want to digitize all the individual buildings, in fact, you couldn't do so because it's only in large block form here. I know that some of the later maps of Rangoon, for example, show a single line here. You can use dissolve and choose just the selected features. And that will create a dissolved version of those polygons in the cases where they're adjacent. You could put all those together if you wanted to. But basically, the point here is there is a new way of bringing in points for your georectification tool, which involves using a base map that you have showing in QGIS. In this case, it is a collection of buildings, and these open vector tiles that we brought in using the vector tiles reader. You could have done just as well with one of these XYZ base maps as well, although it's a little less clear when it comes to the resolution.